The night my farm turned to ash, my own family stood beside me and called me homeless. The word hung in the cool autumn air like something heavier than smoke, something that settled deep into my bones and refused to leave. I remember watching the last thin ribbon of gray rise from what used to be my barn, the place where my husband Daniel had spent 40 years fixing broken gates and oiling rusted hinges, the place where we measured our lives not in calendars but in harvests. The smell of burned wood clung to my sweater, to my hair, to the inside of my throat. Tasted like endings. The sheriff's cruiser idled at the edge of the gravel road, red and blue lights washing over the blackened fields in slow, silent waves. Neighbors stood in small clusters, hands tucked into jacket pockets, voices low and careful. Everyone knew me here. Margaret Collins, the woman who baked pies for the church fundraiser and lent out tools without writing down names. The woman who never asked for help. Until now. "You can't stay here," Heather said, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearest group of onlookers. She stood beside my son Brian, her designer boots sinking slightly into the damp dirt as if even the ground didn't quite accept her. "There's nothing left. You have nowhere to go." I didn't look at her right away. I kept my eyes on the farmhouse porch or what remained of it. One crooked white column still stood, stubborn and alone, like it hadn't received the memo that everything else was gone. I thought of the mornings Daniel and I drank coffee there, steam curling into the sunrise while the horses grazed beyond the fence line. 40 acres of routine. 40 acres of quiet dignity. 40 acres reduced to a memory before midnight. "Mom," Brian said softly, but there was distance in his tone, a careful politeness I'd only heard him use with strangers. "Maybe we should talk about options. There's a shelter in Millbrook. Or one of those senior living places. They have activities." Activities. I almost smiled. As if grief were a hobby you could sign up for on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The wind picked up, sending loose flakes of soot skittering across the driveway like dark snow. My old pickup truck sat near the mailbox, its paint dulled by years of sun, its bed still carrying a coil of rope and a dented feed bucket. I had planned to clean it out that morning. I had planned a lot of things that morning. Heather crossed her arms. "We can't take you in, Margaret. The kids need stability. And honestly this situation isn't something we can fix." Her eyes flicked toward the watching neighbors again, as if the performance required witnesses. Somewhere down the road, a dog barked once and then fell silent. I felt the weight of every gaze, every unspoken judgment. Not pity. Not exactly. Something closer to relief that misfortune had chosen someone else tonight. I took a slow breath. Smoke still lingered in the back of my lungs. "I understand," I said. My voice sounded steady, almost unfamiliar. Brian nodded quickly, grateful for the lack of resistance. Heather relaxed her shoulders, already victorious. They didn't notice the way I turned toward the truck instead of toward them. They didn't notice the small envelope tucked inside the glove compartment until much later, when it was too late for noticing to matter. I climbed into the driver's seat and closed the door. The cab smelled faintly of leather and peppermint gum, of all the miles I had driven alone without ever feeling alone. Through the dusty windshield, I saw the town I had helped build standing at a careful distance from my ruin. I rested my hands on the steering wheel, rough palms against worn plastic, and let the engine idle. Heather's voice drifted after me one last time. "You'll figure something out," she called, already turning away. I watched her walk back to the SUV, her silhouette framed by flashing lights and rising dawn. Then I reached forward, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out the envelope I had kept for nearly 30 years. The photograph inside showed a younger version of me holding a laughing boy with dark hair and serious eyes. On the back, written in neat blue ink, were 3 words and a phone number I had never needed until now. The road out of town felt longer than it had ever been before, as if the miles themselves had stretched overnight to put distance between who I used to be and who I was becoming. I drove without turning on the radio, letting the steady hum of the engine fill the silence. That my thoughts could not quite organize yet. Dawn had begun to soften the sky into pale shades of blue and silver, and the fields on either side of the highway lay still under a thin blanket of frost. I had driven this route thousands of times over the years, hauling feed, picking up supplies, taking Daniel to doctor appointments in the city, yet that morning every familiar landmark seemed to belong to someone else's life. My hand stayed firm on the steering wheel, even when my chest tightened at the memory of the porch light we used to leave on for each other when one of us came home late. I did not cry. There was a time when I might have. There was a time when loss had felt like a storm that demanded tears as proof that it mattered. Now it felt quieter than that. Now it felt like a door closing somewhere deep inside me, one that I did not intend to open again. After about 20 miles I pulled into the parking lot of a gas station that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and motor oil, the kind of place where truckers nodded politely without asking questions. I shut off the engine and sat for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than it had the night before, but there was something steadier in my eyes too, something that had not been there when I was still standing in front of the ruins of my home. I reached into my coat pocket and took out the envelope again, smoothing the creases with careful fingers. The photograph had faded slightly over the decades, but the boy's smile remained bright enough to cut through time. Lucas Bennett had been 6 years old when his parents first brought him to the farm, nervous and pale after yet another round of boarding schools that never seemed to work. They had asked if I could keep an eye on him for the summer while they traveled for business. I had agreed because Daniel believed that children deserved places where they could breathe. Lucas had followed me everywhere that summer, through rows of corn taller than both of us, into the barn where he learned how to brush a horse without flinching, onto the back porch where we counted fireflies, until he fell asleep with his head against my shoulder. He had been a lonely child with too much money surrounding him and not enough kindness reaching him. Before he left that August, he had pressed the photograph into my hand and asked me to promise that I would call him if I ever needed anything. I had laughed then, the way older women sometimes laugh at the impossible sincerity of youth. I had told him I would be just fine. For nearly 30 years I had kept that promise to myself. I stepped out of the truck and walked toward the payphone that still stood beside the building like a relic from another century. Most people use cell phones now, but I had always liked the certainty of coins and numbers you could dial without worrying about batteries or signal bars. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I pushed open the glass door and slipped inside. It smelled faintly of metal and dust. I held the photograph up to the weak fluorescent light one more time, tracing the familiar digits written in blue ink on the back. My hands did not tremble. Not when I fed the quarters into the slot. Not when I lifted the receiver to my ear. Not even when the line began to ring, each distant tone echoing through years of silence, and all the miles I had never imagined traveling alone. Somewhere beyond the frost-covered fields and the empty highways, a life I had once helped shape was about to intersect with the one I was learning to rebuild. The ringing seemed to stretch across an entire lifetime before it finally stopped, and a voice I had not heard in nearly 3 decades answered on the other end. It was deeper now, steady in a way that suggested boardrooms and decisions measured in millions. Yet there was still something unmistakably familiar beneath the polish. For a brief moment I said nothing. I listened to the faint echo of distant traffic behind him, the soft click of a door closing somewhere in his world. Then I spoke his name quietly, as if testing whether time had truly left a path between us. There was a pause so sudden and complete that I could almost hear his memory searching. When he said my name in return, it was not a question. It was recognition. I closed my eyes and let the cold metal receiver rest against my temple, as the early morning light filtered through the dusty glass booth. Outside, a semi-truck rumbled past the pumps, its engine vibration traveling up through the soles of my boots. Lucas asked where I was. He did not ask why I had called. Some people learn early that explanations can wait when someone they care about finally reaches out. I told him the name of the town, the mile marker near the interstate, the faded sign that advertised homemade pies even though the diner had been closed for years. I told him I had lost the farm. The words sounded smaller than the reality. I did not tell him about Heather's voice or the way Brian had looked at the ground instead of at me. Those details belonged to a chapter one had already begun closing. Lucas remained silent for a long second, and then he exhaled slowly as if making room for a decision that had already formed. He said he was sending someone to get me. He said I should not go anywhere. I almost laughed at the certainty in his tone, the way he still spoke as if the world were something he could rearrange with enough intention. After we hung up, I stepped back into the morning that had grown brighter without asking my permission. Frost glittered along the edges of the parking lot like scattered glass, delicate and temporary. I bought a cup of coffee that tasted like cardboard and warmth, and I sat on the hood of my truck watching the highway wake up. Families drove past in minivans filled with backpacks and breakfast wrappers. A man in a construction vest leaned against his pickup scrolling through his phone. Life continued with its usual stubborn rhythm. For the first time since the fire, I allowed myself to feel something other than exhaustion. It was not hope exactly. Hope had always seemed like a fragile thing, dependent on other people's kindness or circumstances that could turn without warning. What I felt now was closer to resolve, a quiet understanding that my story had not ended in those ashes. My phone, an old flip model I rarely used, buzzed in my coat pocket with an unfamiliar number. A calm female voice introduced herself as Lucas's assistant and confirmed my location. With precise efficiency, she asked if I needed medical attention or food or a place to rest. I told her I was fine. I told her I had managed harder mornings than this one. She said a vehicle would arrive within 2 hours. I finished my coffee slowly, savoring the simple act of waiting for something instead of waiting for nothing. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost into thin streams that ran toward the cracked asphalt. I thought about the farm again, about the way Daniel used to say that land remembers who loves it. I wondered if memory worked the same way for people. Whether somewhere in Lucas Bennett's vast world, there had always been a small, steady space reserved for a woman who once showed him how to plant tomatoes in straight lines and believed that growth was possible even after harsh seasons. I did not know what would happen when the car arrived. I did not know what kind of life waited beyond the next turn in the road. But as I watched the horizon shimmer in the rising heat, I realized that for the first time in many years, the future felt like something I was walking toward instead of something that was quietly closing in behind me. The first sign that Lucas had truly meant what he said was not the sound of an expensive engine or the flash of polished chrome, but the subtle change in the way people around me began to notice. It started with the clerk inside the gas station stepping out to sweep the sidewalk even though it was already clean, her eyes drifting toward the highway every few seconds as if she sensed something unusual approaching. Then a pair of local teenagers who had been laughing beside their dusty sedan fell quiet, their attention fixed on the distant curve of the road where heat shimmered above the asphalt like a mirage. I remained seated on the hood of my truck, my hands folded loosely in my lap, feeling the warmth of the rising sun seep through the thin denim of my jeans. Time slowed in a way that felt deliberate, as if the morning itself had decided to hold its breath. When the vehicle finally appeared, it did not announce itself with noise or spectacle. It simply emerged from the horizon, long and dark and impossibly clean against the pale landscape, gliding forward with the kind of confidence that comes from belonging everywhere and nowhere at once. It came to a stop beside the pumps with a quiet precision that made even the idling semi-truck seem clumsy by comparison. The driver stepped out first, tall and composed in a tailored suit that looked out of place among the faded signs and cracked concrete. He removed his sunglasses and asked with careful respect if I was Margaret Collins. I nodded once. He opened the rear door as though this were the most natural gesture in the world. For a moment I hesitated, not because I doubted Lucas but because crossing that small distance from my old truck to this unfamiliar comfort felt like stepping across an invisible line between two versions of myself. I glanced back at the pickup, at the coil of rope and the dented bucket still resting in the bed, at the thin layer of frost that had not yet fully melted in the shadows. Everything I had been was contained in that worn metal shell. Everything I might become waited in the quiet interior of the car. I rose slowly and gathered my coat tighter around me. The teenagers were openly staring now. The clerk had stopped sweeping altogether. Somewhere nearby a screen door creaked as another curious witness stepped outside. I lowered myself into the seat and felt the soft leather give beneath my weight, warm and unfamiliar. The driver closed the door with a gentle click that sounded final in a way I could not quite explain. As we pulled onto the highway, I watched the gas station shrink in the side mirror until it became just another forgotten landmark along a road that no longer belonged to my past. The countryside rolled by in broad strokes of brown fields and silver silos, winter waiting patiently at the edges of every fence line. I did not ask where we were going. The driver did not offer unnecessary details. There was dignity in that silence, a shared understanding that some journeys do not need to be narrated. Instead I let my thoughts wander back to the farm, Not to the flames or the smoke, but to the quiet mornings when dew clung to the grass and Daniel's laughter carried across the yard like a promise that hard work would always lead somewhere worth reaching. I wondered what he would think if he could see me now, sitting in a car that probably cost more than our entire property once had. He would have teased me gently, I suspected. He would have said that life has a way of surprising even the most stubborn plans. The road curved toward the city skyline rising faintly in the distance, a cluster of glass and steel catching the sunlight like a field of mirrors. I felt no fear as we approached it, only a calm awareness that the woman who had driven out of town at dawn had already begun to change, not because of wealth or rescue, but because she had finally accepted that survival sometimes requires stepping into spaces you never imagined claiming as your own. Somewhere ahead, Lucas Bennett was waiting, and with him the first real chance in years to decide for myself what came next. The city revealed itself gradually, not with a single dramatic skyline but in layers of movement and sound that grew denser with every passing mile. Traffic thickened into steady rivers of metal and glass, brake lights blinking like quiet signals in a language I had never needed to learn before. I sat back against the soft leather seat and watched storefronts and office towers slide past the tinted window, each one reflecting a version of life that had always existed somewhere beyond the boundaries of my fields. The driver navigated the crowded streets with calm precision, turning corners as though he had memorized the rhythm of this place long ago. I found myself noticing small details instead of the overwhelming scale of it all. A woman in a navy coat balancing 2 cups of coffee while speaking into a phone. A construction worker pausing to stretch his back beside a half-finished building. A row of neatly trimmed trees planted in perfect symmetry along a wide boulevard. Everything here seemed intentional, measured, controlled. It was a different kind of farming, I realized. Instead of soil and seasons, this world cultivated time and opportunity. We slowed near an intersection where a digital billboard flashed news headlines in bright colors. One of them showed a photograph I recognized instantly even though decades had reshaped the boy into a man. Lucas Bennett stood beside a ceremonial ribbon, smiling for a crowd of cameras, his name printed in bold letters beneath. A caption about expansion and innovation. I studied his face as the car idled at the light, searching for traces of the child who once followed me through rows of corn with mud on his sneakers and questions in his eyes. They were still there, hidden beneath the confidence and tailored suit. The same quiet determination that had made him insist on learning how to mend a broken fence, rather than letting someone else do it for him. The same gratitude that had filled his voice the night he promised I would never be alone if I ever reached out. The light turned green and the image disappeared behind us. We turned onto a narrower street lined with older brick buildings, their windows framed by wrought iron balconies and hanging plants that swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The driver finally spoke, his tone respectful and clear. He said we were almost there. I nodded without asking further questions, trusting the path that had already carried me this far. When the car stopped in front of a building that rose 12 stories into the sky, I felt an unexpected stillness settle over me. It was not intimidation or awe. It was recognition, not of the structure itself but of the moment, the kind that divides a life into before and after without needing permission. The driver opened my door and offered his hand. I stepped onto the polished sidewalk and looked up at the reflective glass that mirrored the clouds drifting overhead. Somewhere inside, Lucas Bennett was waiting. I could feel it with the same certainty I used to feel when rain was coming before the sky had even begun to darken. As we entered the lobby, cool air wrapped around me like a quiet welcome. The space was wide and bright, filled with the low murmur of conversations and the distant chime of elevators arriving and departing in perfect intervals. A receptionist glanced up from her desk, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to something warmer when she noticed the driver's subtle nod. She picked up a phone and spoke softly, then gestured toward a set of glass doors at the far end of the room. I walked forward with measured steps, my reflection moving beside me across the polished floor. For the first time since the fire, I did not feel like someone who had lost everything. Felt like someone who had been led, carefully and deliberately, to the next field she was meant to tend, even if she did not yet know what would grow there. I saw him before he saw me. He stood near the tall windows at the end of the corridor, hands loosely folded behind his back, watching the city stretch out beneath him as if it were a map he had memorized. For a moment I simply stopped walking. The years between us felt both enormous and irrelevant, like miles crossed in a single step. Lucas Bennett had grown into the kind of man newspapers like to photograph beside steel beams and smiling officials, yet there was something unchanged in the way he turned when he sensed movement behind him. Recognition came instantly. His expression did not pass through surprise or doubt. It softened, then steadied, as though he had always known this day might arrive. He crossed the distance between us without hesitation and took my hands in his, warm and certain, grounding me more effectively than any polished floor or towering glass ever could. He did not comment on the smoke that still clung faintly to my coat or the exhaustion I could feel settling in my shoulders. He simply said he was glad I had called. The simplicity of it nearly undid me. We sat in a quiet office that overlooked a grid of streets alive with motion. Coffee appeared without being ordered, placed gently beside my elbow by someone who understood that comfort sometimes comes in small, predictable rituals. Lucas listened as I spoke, not interrupting, not filling the pauses that came when memories caught unexpectedly in my throat. I told him about the fire in plain words, about the farm that had been more than land, about the way seasons once marked time for me more reliably than clocks. I did not linger on Heather's voice or Brian's silence. Lucas did not need those details to understand the shape of loss. When I finished, he remained quiet for a moment, studying the steam rising from his cup as though it carried answers hidden within it. Then he began asking questions that surprised me with their precision. He wanted to know the acreage of the surrounding properties. He wanted to know who owned the grain storage facility near the highway, and whether the county had been discussing zoning changes. He asked about soil quality and irrigation lines, and the condition of the access road after heavy rain. It was as if the boy who once followed me through fields had grown into a man who now saw land not only as memory but as strategy. I realized then that he was not simply offering me refuge. He was already building something around the absence I had described. When he finally leaned back in his chair, a quiet resolve had settled over his features. He told me I would not be staying in a shelter or a rented room or anywhere that felt temporary. He said there was a guest suite prepared on the upper floors where I could rest as long as I needed. He spoke of a team that would begin looking into the circumstances of the fire and the ownership records of nearby parcels. His tone remained calm, almost conversational, yet beneath it I sensed the same determination that had once driven a lonely child to master tasks far beyond his years just to prove he belonged. I found myself watching the city again through the wide window, noticing how sunlight bounced from building to building until even the narrowest alley seemed touched by brightness. Somewhere far below, traffic lights changed in patient cycles, guiding strangers through intersections they trusted without question. Lucas followed my gaze and said that change often begins quietly, long before anyone recognizes its direction. I understood then that this meeting was not the end of a difficult journey, but the beginning of one shaped by choices I had not yet imagined making. For the first time since the night the flames erased the familiar outlines of my life, I felt the steady return of something that resembled purpose. Not the old purpose tied to fences and harvest schedules, but a new one rooted in the knowledge that survival can open doors just as surely as it closes others. Lucas stood and offered to show me where I would be staying. I rose with him, aware that each step forward carried me farther from the woman who had believed her world ended at the edge of a burned field, and closer to someone who might yet decide how wide her horizon could become. The guest suite Lucas showed me was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as though the entire floor had been designed to protect people from the noise of their own thoughts. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a view of the river cutting through the city like a ribbon of moving glass, sunlight scattering across its surface in slow shifting patterns. I set my small overnight bag on the edge of a neatly made bed and ran my hand across the crisp white coverlet, surprised by how unfamiliar comfort could feel after a lifetime of choosing practicality over luxury. Lucas did not linger. He understood that adjustment takes time, that even kindness can overwhelm when it arrives too suddenly. Before he left, he placed a simple key card on the nightstand and told me there was a kitchen downstairs if I needed anything, that someone would bring clean clothes and toiletries within the hour. He said I should rest. The door closed softly behind him, leaving me alone with a silence that was not empty but expectant. I walked slowly through the suite, touching surfaces as though confirming they were real. The polished wood desk, the framed photographs of distant landscapes, the soft rug beneath my boots that muffled each step. When I finally sat by the window, The city stretched below me in orderly grids, traffic flowing with the same steady rhythm I had noticed earlier. From this height, everything seemed manageable. Problems reduced to patterns. Decisions to simple turns left or right. I realized how rarely I had allowed myself to step back and see the larger picture of my own life. On the farm, every day demanded immediate action. Fences needed mending. Crops needed tending. Bills needed paying. Reflection had always felt like a luxury reserved for people who did not have dirt under their fingernails. A quiet knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. A young woman entered with 2 garment bags and a small suitcase, her smile professional but kind. She introduced herself and explained that Lucas had asked her to make sure I had what I needed for the next few days. The clothes she hung in the closet were simple and well made, chosen with an understanding that dignity often lives in the details. After she left, I changed into a soft sweater and trousers that fit as though they had been measured years ago. I stood before the mirror and studied the reflection looking back at me. The lines around my eyes had not disappeared. The silver in my hair still caught the light in uneven strands. But there was a steadiness in my posture that had been missing since the night I watched smoke claim everything I thought defined me. Later that afternoon, Lucas returned carrying a folder thick with documents. We sat together at the small table near the window, the city's distant hum filling the spaces between his explanations. He told me he had already begun acquiring parcels of land surrounding what had once been my property. He spoke of development plans halted mid-negotiation, of investors willing to sell quietly when presented with the right opportunity. His voice remained calm, yet I could feel the momentum building beneath his words. He said he did not believe in leaving loose ends, that stability required more than sympathy. It required action shaped by foresight. I listened carefully, asking questions I had not expected myself to understand. Acreage totals, water rights, county regulations. Each answer seemed to restore a piece of the confidence I had lost. By the time the sun began to dip behind the skyline, painting the windows in warm amber light, I realized that this new chapter was not about being rescued. It was about being repositioned. The farm had been my world once. Now the world itself was expanding, inviting me to consider possibilities that had never existed within the narrow borders of survival. When Lucas finally stood to leave again, he paused at the door and said that sometimes the strongest fields are the ones that have been burned, because they remember what it took to endure. I watched him go, feeling the quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be dictated by those who had dismissed me as a burden but by the choices I was only beginning to understand I could make. The next morning arrived without the heaviness that had followed me through so many dawns before. Sunlight spilled across the wide glass windows in long golden lines that seemed to map out a future I was only beginning to recognize as my own. I woke earlier than I needed to, the way farmers do after decades of training their bodies to rise before the land itself feels ready. For a few seconds I did not remember where I was. The silence was too complete, too carefully arranged. Then the memory of polished floors, quiet elevators, and Lucas's steady voice returned like a slow tide, and I sat up with a calm I had not felt since long before the fire. I dressed in one of the simple outfits that had been provided and made my way downstairs, guided more by instinct than direction. The building had already come alive with purposeful movement. Men and women crossed the lobby with tablets in their hands and determination in their eyes, each one part of a system that operated with the same discipline I once associated only with planting seasons and harvest deadlines. I found Lucas in a conference room overlooking the river, studying a digital map projected across an entire wall. When he noticed me, he smiled in that quiet way that made success seem like something earned rather than displayed. He gestured for me to come closer. Colored outlines marked parcels of land I knew as well as the lines on my own hands. The highway curve where the old diner sign leaned sideways. The narrow creek that flooded every spring if the snow melted too quickly. Even the grain storage facility Brian had once talked about expanding. Lucas explained that negotiations had moved faster than expected. Several owners had been ready to sell for years, but had been waiting for someone with both vision and resources to make the first move. He spoke of consolidation and redevelopment, of agricultural technology firms interested in sustainable projects, of training centers that could bring new life to towns people had begun quietly abandoning. I listened, astonished by how naturally his plans incorporated not just profit but restoration. He said he believed land deserved second chances just as much as people did. We spent hours reviewing documents and proposals, my voice growing stronger with every question I asked. Somewhere between discussing irrigation systems and zoning approvals, I realized that the narrative I had accepted about myself, as someone left behind, was beginning to dissolve. Lucas was not building a monument to my past. He was inviting me to participate in shaping what came next. Later that afternoon, he arranged for a short drive back toward the outskirts of town. From the back seat of another sleek vehicle, I watched familiar roads appear again, their curves and dips triggering memories I could finally observe without feeling crushed by them. When we stopped at a hill overlooking what had once been my farm, I stepped out into the cool breeze and breathed in deeply. The charred remains were still visible, stark against the muted colors of late autumn, but they no longer represented an ending. Survey flags dotted the surrounding acreage like quiet promises. Lucas stood beside me and spoke of timelines and construction phases, of partnerships that would bring jobs and training opportunities to families who had begun to believe opportunity existed only somewhere else. I did not need to respond right away. The wind carried the faint scent of earth turning over in distant fields, and I felt something within me shift into alignment with it. Loss had forced me onto a path I would never have chosen. Now that same path was opening into terrain wide enough to hold both memory and ambition. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the land that had once defined me, I understood that reclaiming dignity does not always mean returning to what was lost. Sometimes it means standing in the same place with new purpose, ready to plant seeds no one else imagined could grow there. By the time winter began to settle across the valley, the land that had once felt like a scar had started to resemble a blueprint. From the wide window of Lucas's office, I could see the first outlines of change taking shape in measured, deliberate movements. Survey crews moved across fields that had stood untouched for years, placing markers with the same quiet focus I used to bring to planting rows of corn straight enough to satisfy Daniel's exacting eye. The newspapers called it a redevelopment initiative. Local radio hosts debated whether the town would survive the transition or finally become another forgotten on a map. I listened to it all without needing to defend what I already understood. Transformation rarely looks graceful from the outside. It often resembles uncertainty before it becomes opportunity. Lucas had insisted that I be present for the early planning meetings, not as a guest but as someone whose experience carried weight. At first I sat silently at the long conference table, hands folded, absorbing the language of projections and logistics that once felt foreign to me. Then gradually I began to speak. I asked about soil drainage patterns that could affect construction schedules. I reminded them which access roads turned to mud after heavy snowfall. I suggested that training programs include young people who had grown up believing their only future lay somewhere else. Each time I contributed, I felt another fragment of my confidence return, fitting into place like a puzzle piece that had never truly been lost. One afternoon Lucas handed me a folder thicker than any document I had held in years. Inside were deeds and agreements, legal confirmations that the land surrounding what remained of my farm now belonged to a foundation he had established in my name. I read every page slowly, not because I doubted his intentions, but because I wanted to feel the reality of it settle into my bones. Ownership, he explained, did not mean returning to the past. It meant having the authority to shape what replaced it. The first time I drove back alone weeks later, the road felt different beneath the tires. Familiar curves no longer carried the weight of abandonment. Instead they felt like invitations. Construction equipment stood idle in neat rows waiting for spring. Temporary offices had been set up where the old grain storage facility once cast its long shadow across the fields. A few former neighbors approached cautiously, curiosity overcoming the pride that had kept them distant after the fire. They asked questions in careful voices. They wanted to know whether the rumors were true, whether jobs would return, whether their children might finally have a reason to stay. I answered as honestly as I could, aware that trust grows slowly even when hope arrives suddenly. Later that evening, as I walked the perimeter of the property that had once defined my entire existence, I noticed fresh footprints beside my own. Brian stood near the edge of the charred foundation, his shoulders hunched against the cold wind. He looked older than I remembered, uncertainty softening the certainty that had once driven him to dismiss me so easily. He did not apologize. Not directly. Instead, he asked if there would be room for him to help when the rebuilding began. I studied his face for a long moment, searching for the boy who used to run barefoot through these same fields without worrying about consequences. Time had changed both of us. I told him that second chances require more than words. They require patience, humility, and the willingness to learn from what was nearly lost. He nodded, accepting the answer even though it offered no immediate comfort. As dusk settled over the valley, I stood alone again, watching the last light fade across land that had survived fire, neglect, and doubt. The silence no longer felt like an ending, felt like space. Space wide enough to hold regret and forgiveness, ambition and memory. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of machinery preparing for another day's work echoed like a promise. I turned toward the road with steady steps, aware that my story had not been rewritten by wealth or rescue, but by the quiet decision to rise after everything familiar had fallen away. And for the first time in a very long while, the future did not feel like something to fear. It felt like something I was finally ready to claim.